Story 1. I want to say up front that I'm not a paranoid person, and I don't have a history of being dramatic about stuff like this. I'm a 26-year-old woman, and I've driven alone at night my whole adult life without ever feeling genuinely scared about it. I say that because what happened on this particular night was not me being jumpy. It was real, and I knew it was real about 4 minutes in. It was a Wednesday night in November, and I was driving home from my friend's place, about a 25-minute drive through a mix of residential streets and a couple of main roads. I'd done that drive probably 100 times. About 5 minutes in, I noticed a car behind me. Dark-colored, couldn't tell the make. Nothing unusual about that. But when I turned off the main road onto the first residential street, it turned too. When I turned again onto a smaller road that basically only leads to my neighborhood, it turned again. I told myself to stop being weird about it. Then I turned onto my actual street, and it turned onto my street. I didn't pull into my driveway. Something just told me not to, and I'm really glad I listened. I kept driving, went straight past my house, and at the end of the street I turned right instead of the left I'd normally take. The car turned right. At this point, my hands were shaking, and I was driving with one hand and had my phone in the other, trying to dial my boyfriend. He didn't pick up. I turned left, then immediately left again, then right. A random sequence of turns through streets I didn't fully know, just trying to get somewhere busy and well lit. The car stayed behind me through everyone. I ended up driving to a 24-hour petrol station about 2 kilometers away, pulled right up under the brightest light I could find, and sat there with the engine running and my doors locked. The car that had been following me slowed down as it passed the entrance. It drove past really slowly, and I saw the driver looking directly at me through the window. Then it kept going and was gone. I sat in that petrol station for 45 minutes before I felt okay enough to drive home. I went in and told the guy working behind the counter what had happened, and he walked me back out to my car when I was ready to leave. I've never found out who that was or what they wanted. I genuinely don't let myself think too hard about what would have happened if I'd pulled into my driveway like I normally would. Story 2. This one happened over the course of about 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon, which is what made it so unsettling. It wasn't dark, it wasn't isolated. It was the middle of the day in a busy part of the city. And somehow that made it worse, because I kept second-guessing myself. Because surely something like this doesn't happen in broad daylight with crowds around you. I first noticed the man in a coffee shop. I was sitting by the window, and he was at a table near the door, maybe mid-40s, grey jacket, just sitting there with no drink in front of him. I noticed him because he was looking at me, and when I looked back, he didn't look away. I packed up and left earlier than I'd planned. 20 minutes later, I was in a bookshop about 3 streets away, and I looked up from a shelf, and he was at the end of the same aisle. Grey jacket, same man. He was looking at the books, but in that way, where you can tell someone isn't actually reading the spines, just using them as a reason to stand there. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. I moved to a different section, and after about 2 minutes, I looked back, and he had moved too, 1 bookcase over. I went straight to the counter and asked the woman working there if I could stand near her for a minute, because I thought someone was following me. She just said, of course, asked me to describe him, and said she'd keep an eye on him. I called my flatmate and stayed on the phone while I walked to the tube station. My flatmate met me at the other end. I reported it to the British Transport Police when I got to the station. I don't know if anything ever came of it. I've never seen that man again. But I think about the version of me that didn't say anything to the woman in the bookshop and just quietly moved around, hoping it would stop on its own. And I'm really glad that's not what I did. Story 3. This was about 2 years ago, and I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. I live alone in a ground floor flat, and I've always been fairly relaxed about it, because it's a quiet street, and I've never had any issues. That changed on a Tuesday evening in February. I was sitting on my sofa watching something on my laptop, and I happened to glance toward the window, which looks out onto the street. There was a man standing on the pavement, directly outside. Not walking past, not waiting for someone, just standing there facing my window. My blinds were down, but not fully. There was maybe a 2-inch gap at the bottom. I told myself he was waiting for someone. I looked away, and when I looked back, maybe 10 minutes later, he was still there. Same spot. Not on his phone, not looking up and down the street. Just standing there facing my window. I turned my lamp off, so the room was darker, and moved closer to the window to get a better look. He was probably in his 30s, hands in his pockets. No obvious reason to be standing there. He wasn't near a bus stop. There are no shops on that part of the street. I watched him for another 15 minutes. At one point, he took a few steps to the left, which brought him slightly closer to my front door, and then he stopped again. That's when I rang my upstairs neighbor and explained what was happening. He came straight down, and we looked out together through the small glass pane at the top of my front door. The man was still there. My neighbor opened the front door and said, "Can I help you, mate?" The man looked at him for a second and then just walked off down the street. No explanation, nothing. Just turned and walked away without a single word. My neighbor helped me check that every window was locked and stayed for a while until I'd calmed down. I reported it to the police that night, and they mentioned there'd been a couple of similar reports in the area recently, which honestly was not as reassuring as they probably meant it to be. I have a proper blind on that window now, the kind with no gap at the bottom at all. And I don't sit with the lamp on in the evenings without it being fully closed first. I hate that I had to change the way I live in my own home because of one random person standing outside on a Tuesday night. But here we are. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more.